Hey everybody, and welcome to My Friend the Reader. So today's going to be a slightly more somber video. I was thinking of doing a monthly wrap-up, which is quite common on BookTube, but if people who have been following the literary world know that this has been a rather rough few days. For people who follow literature closely or awards, we definitely had some sad and disappointing news, and I'll get to that in a second. So what I decided to do, instead of doing a wrap-up video, I've already done a review of my favorite book from last month, I would rather do something else. And if you see my profile and you go to my blog, you know I'm quite political, and I see literature as culture and understanding it within a larger political context as quite important to our both in terms of understanding the significance of themes that are carried in books, but also the kinds of role that literature can play in advancing struggles for better understanding or social change. And so I feel it's only fair then that once in a while I'm going to post a blog or a vlog that's a little more political in its nature. And the events of last week, I think, merit that. So it all started off, and it was a story that had been going on for quite a bit of time, was the scandal that was bringing down the Nobel Committee in Sweden. This is the committee that awards the Nobel Prize in Literature, which is seen as the most prestigious literary award in the world. And I don't want to get bogged down in too many details, but effectively the husband of one of the key committee persons had been accused of, one, sexual impropriety, and second of all, leaking the winners of several Nobel Awards to the media. And so there had been back and forth where people wanted some sort of condemnation, including criticisms of the accused's wife, that didn't result in any sanction, and consequently a bunch of people stepped off the committee. Technically you weren't allowed to resign, and you can't be replaced until someone dies, and there's quorum rules that are affected, although the King of Sweden has suggested that these rules now need to be changed because the risk of the Nobel not being awarded, or not being unable to award an award or a prize because of the lack of quorum. So last Friday, or on Friday morning, we get the news that the Nobel Prize functionaries had determined that there would be no award this year. There would be 2 awards in 2019 that would allow them to let the instability settle and maybe some consequences be handed down. Obviously this happens in the context of the Me Too movement, where bad behavior that had once been forgiven or people look the other way is no longer being done so, and as a result the Nobel Committee felt that it would be wrong for them to go ahead and award a prize this year. So most people thought that would be the biggest news of Friday, and it was a shame, but people had seen it coming for a while. And then we get the breaking news about Junot Diaz. Junot Diaz is probably the primary voice of Latin American or Latino literature in the United States. His book, The Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, won the Pulitzer back in, I think, 2008 or 2007. His subsequent book, This Is How You Lose Her, was shortlisted for the National Book Award. He is regularly featured in various various magazines and newspaper articles. He's the one novelist that sits on the Pulitzer committee, not the jury, but the larger committee. So he's definitely one of the most significant players in American literature. And a few weeks ago, he released what was deemed at the time a very powerful piece about his experience of sexual abuse or being sexually abused as a child and how that impacted him. And in almost a throwaway way, and people have been critical of this, he makes a comment to the effect that this experience shaped him as a man and led him to engage in damaging behavior where he hurt others. And what he meant by hurt others was never explained. There were no details. But in the last few days, we're beginning to see what kind of behavior he did engage in that is more than problematic. So he was speaking, I guess, at the Sydney Writers' Festival in Australia a few days ago, where Zinzi Clemens, who is an up-and-coming American writer who wrote What We Lose last year. I think she was on the National Book Awards 5 under 35. She challenged him during a question period and noted that when she was a graduate student, she had invited Diaz to speak at her school, after which he cornered her, attempted to kiss her, and then engaged in a series of emails, details that we don't know of, but definitely behavior that Clemens identified as harassing. This was it's unclear exactly how that was received, what Diaz's response was at the actual event. Apparently the room was in shock. Clemens notes, though, that they still gave him a round of applause, which was quite hurtful for her afterwards. She then proceeded to write out her account in a Twitter thread. I'll be linking everything below. In response to her thread, Carmen Maria Machado, who was a National Book Awards finalist last year for her short story collection, Her Body and Other Parties, came out and noted not a sexual encounter, but definitely a very aggressive encounter that she had with Diaz at a reading he did for This Is How You Lose Her, where Machado challenged some of the portrayals of maleness in Diaz's work in terms of what was deemed acceptable behavior and treatment of women within his characters, in which of what we get from Machado's account, his response was incredibly defensive, belittling, where he wouldn't let Machado at one point actually just want to cool things down. He wouldn't allow her to do so, and behavior that I would characterize as unacceptable in terms of someone as powerful as Diaz, who writes very beautifully in my opinion, but also with problematic elements within the context of his writing, to engage in that kind of berating, condescending behavior towards a young woman writer, not appropriate. And then there's been a series of other accounts that have come out since. Subsequently, Diaz has withdrew from the festival, and I guess is headed home. And he did issue some sort of statement saying he's responsible for his actions, but what that means, what does accountability mean in this particular case, it's unclear. What does it mean for Diaz's career moving forward is also unclear. And so I just wanted to delve into some of that. And so you're probably wondering, okay, what's this guy talking about an issue of the Me Too movement, and what do I have to offer? So I'm sensitive to that, but I am Latino. My parents were Chilean. They came here after the coup in 1973. They arrived in Canada in 1974. So definitely one element of my identity as a child of immigrants is my Latin American roots. And so in a publishing world, which most people will comment is for years has been dominated by white men, where the canon of great literature, both in Canada and the United States, is dominated by either white men or occasionally white women. To have such a powerful voice like Diaz rise to the top, become a center of literary attention, whose book Oscar Wilde arguably has become a part of the American canon, is quite important, right? And for those who look for writing that in some respects reflects our identities, Diaz's voice was important, and to hear what's happened and the potential ostracizing of Diaz, which very likely will be the result of this, is disappointing. It's saddening. You know, I have to say it's something that's been on my mind for the last several days, coming to terms with the fact that someone who was an important voice and is an important voice for Latinos in the United States engaged in this kind of behavior. Now, apparently there were rumors, and the Whisper Network was quite strong for Diaz. Obviously, as a lowly reader, we don't get access to that. And the fact that it hasn't been spoken about, I think, reflects, how hard it is, especially, young up-and-coming female authors. You can't, or if you want to make it in the industry, to challenge someone to make these accusations against such a powerful figure like Diaz is a no-go. And I think it's only in the context of the Me Too movement where more women have had the confidence to come forward with less fear of repercussion, knowing that they'll be believed and that they will be backed by other powerful voices, is giving confidence to some people. But even still, think about the two writers who've come out are young, but at the same time have all of a sudden become quite established in some sense. Zinzi Clemens is a writer on the rise. Machado's book was a bestseller, and it's only at this point that she felt enough confidence to say something. It'd be curious to know how many other voices who might not feel as confident or have the space to move in, whether those voices are going to be left out as well, because it'll be harder for those individuals to speak. So anyways, so on the one hand, there's disappointment. On the other hand, it's like, how do we judge Diaz now? I think some of the rhetoric that we've seen online, on blog posts and Twitter, has been, on the one hand, noting Diaz's trashy behavior, but also condemnation of what his work means. And I think Machado actually called it trash in one of her tweets. Now, look, Twitter is an emotional and often of the moment writing, so I'm not going to give too much weight to that necessarily. I liked Diaz. He's not my favorite writer, but I liked his writing. I found it raw and engaging and poetic, and especially This Is How You Lose Her, which was my favorite of his books, was something that I found engrossing. It was an enjoyable read. It was problematic, though, and I think Machado's criticisms that she confronted Diaz with are absolutely legitimate. Diaz gives certain characterizations of his male characters in a way that is, on the one hand, he would suggest it's autobiographical and this is how reality is, but on the other hand, just because those characters are realistic doesn't mean that a writer can't engage in such a way that's both critical and allows for growth and challenges behaviors within the text. And in that way, I would suggest Diaz's writing is less able or less accomplished. I think Oscar Wilde, in some respects, tried to deal with issues of masculinity in a more critical manner than This Is How You Lose Her. But the point is that they're not perfect, and there's elements that I think we need to engage in. But is the solution just not to sell his books anymore, to pretend he doesn't exist, which is clearly some of the desired responses and some of the actual responses from bookstores and whatnot. And I'd go suggest that that's not the approach, right? Look, I think we've come to the age that we can't have heroes anymore, even in the literary world. You know, we've seen Junot Diaz, but also Sherman Alexie a few weeks ago, some very prominent progressive voices, particularly hard in Diaz's case, because I would suggest what Diaz brought to the table wasn't just his writing, fiction writing, but he was one of the few writers that wasn't this establishment liberal or moderately left-wing. He was willing to engage in very critical approaches to the ideas of class and empire in the United States, and call it American imperialism in a way that I would suggest most writers, including writers of color in the United States, don't do in the same kind of aggressive and unrelenting way that Diaz was able to do. And now to lose that voice, I think hurts us overall. I think to lose that voice hurts literature as well. So how do we move forward on this? You know, Roxane Gay gave a series of tweets where she said, look, just saying that Junot Diaz is canceled is not the answer, right? We can't just pretend and bury things under the rug. And I think that's the way to approach it. I think we should, on the one hand, come to terms with the problems that writers bring, that all writers bring. They're contradictory figures, they're real people, and in many cases, despite their talent, despite their great work, despite their positives, they engaged in behavior and treatment, in this case misogynistic, sexist, or on the verge of assault, behavior that is not just inappropriate, but negates a lot of the good that they've done. And I think to just pretend someone doesn't exist isn't the approach. I think it's better to continue to engage with people's works, continuing to note the unevenness, the problematic elements of text, and we can discuss those openly in a way that's not where we don't have individuals and authors feeling the need to be defensive about it and respond to in such an aggressive way as Diaz did to Machado. So I think that's part of the issue, and I hope that's the way forward, although we don't know. At this point, people tend to recede and let the fires cool a bit before they come out or try to engage in any form of rehabilitation. And I'm not sure rehabilitation's the answer either. One of the approaches that I think, and I've seen this listed a couple of times, is that we should use this opportunity to raise the voices of female Latino writers. And I think that's admirable. And I admit I'm not familiar with many. Other than Machado, I don't think I've read any female Latina writers. And so maybe as a starting point, that's where we can go start learning more about the kinds of texts and authors who offer an insight that's different from Diaz, to provide a more fuller picture of what the Latin American experience in the United States actually is. So as a good starting point, and maybe to conclude the video, I'd encourage people to go out to pick up Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. It is a short story collection. It is magical. It deals not necessarily as much with Latino issues, but definitely with queer and body issues in a way that is fantastical. It's almost like there's elements of horror, there's elements of fantasy there. Again, genres I'm not necessarily attracted to, but beautifully put together by Machado and definitely worth picking up. So that's a starting point. I'll try to make a commitment to try to find more Latina writers and maybe introduce them through this YouTube channel or other means. But it's unfortunate that this is what has to prompt us to expand our horizons, but it is what it is. So on that somber note, I will see you at the next video. Thank you. Bye-bye.